Well, welcome to the Speaking Your Lingo podcast, where my goal is to help this generation think well. My name is Shane Lingo, and today we are branching into a brand new podcast series that I'm calling The Human Element, Biographical Perspectives. As I was thinking about the focus of today's episode, I started thinking about the question of why do people enjoy studying history? Like, what is it that draws people to it? And what I realized is that different people gain a love for and are attracted to the study of history for different reasons. Some people love the grand story and narrative that can be told as they rediscover the world of the past. They speak of their favorite history teachers from high school and college and the way they could weave even the least fascinating parts of history together into this grand, enjoyable narrative. So for some, it's the story. Others are attracted to the study of times that seemed relatively simple and less chaotic than our own. Some are drawn to the study of battles and wars and the technology and weapons that were used in the past. Some like to study because they are simply fascinated by the question of how things came to be, how things change over time, and in other words, answering the question of why are things the way that they are. All that being said, the study of history has something for all of us. But there is another reason that people love to study history, and this is one of the reasons that I myself am drawn to history. It's because of what I call the human element. Reading the thoughts and perspectives of individuals from a different time and a different place, living in circumstances that are far different from our own. And this is one of the reasons that I'm so drawn to biographies. Biographies give us an insight and perspective into life that we really can't gain any other way. They help us to get outside of our own little bubbles and to develop a sense of gratitude that's really hard for us to develop any other way. Think about it. In most times and places in the world, things were not as great as they are today. And that's especially true if you live in modern America. We have so many things to be grateful for, but sometimes it takes stepping out of our own little worlds and seeing how people in worse circumstances lived and even triumphed through those circumstances. And it's biographies that really allow us to do that. So today, I want to take a look at a man's life who did just that. A man who triumphed in the midst of adversity. A man who faced a reality that the majority of us will never have to face. And my hope is that by looking at his story, we can gain some insights and perspectives for our lives today. With that, today I want to talk about Frederick Douglass. Now, no matter how many times I've studied and read about the history of slavery in early America, I'm always surprised to read firsthand accounts and primary sources of individuals who lived through such experiences. I mean, it's hard to find the right words to describe the reality of what these humans endured. It shows that there is a depth to human depravity that goes far beyond what we often think is possible. On the other hand, we look at these who persevered and were reminded of the goodness that reflects the image of the Creator in His creation. This is what it means to be human, to be created in the image of a just, loving, and good God, and yet, due to the reality of the fall, to have the capacity to commit at times the most atrocious evil. As we get to today's focus, I want to talk about Frederick Douglass's narrative and draw out some of the things that I think are most interesting, some of the most interesting aspects of his life, as well as the life of other slaves that he mentions. And with that, my goal is not really to give a comprehensive look at his life or his work, but it's really to kind of pull out some of the key takeaways that I think are important for our world today. And in doing so, I hope to ignite a desire in you, to those of you who are listening, to go and to read some of these great works for yourself. Now, the main autobiography I want to focus on today is the The Narrative of a Life of Frederick Douglass. But I'll also be drawing from his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. And so to gain some footing, we first have to answer the question, who was Frederick Douglass? And as we're going to see, he was a very fascinating man with a very fascinating life. Douglass was born in Talbot County, Maryland, in the heart of Maryland's Eastern Shore in 1818. And as was true of many slaves during Douglass's time, he didn't know the exact date of his birth. And so this is kind of his best estimate. And for the most part, the reason that he didn't know the exact date of his birth was on purpose. And this was due to the slave owners not wanting their slaves to actually know when they were born. Slave owners often kept personal information from their slaves. But to Douglass' best estimate, he was born sometime within the year of 1818. So picture sometime within the first half of the 19th century. And as we look back at the world that Douglass was born into, this was a time period when slavery was about to hit its peak in the United States. One of the most significant events that occurred the year he was born was the ongoing debate of whether or not to admit Missouri as a slave state, which ultimately is going to end in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And as you might remember from your high school history class, with this compromise, the United States drew a line from the east to the west along the 36th parallel, dividing the nation into two competing halves, half free and half slave. Some of the other things to mention about the America that Douglass was born into: the U.S. was experiencing significant economic growth, which was being driven by factors such as westward expansion, increased trade, and advancements in transportation. Not only that, but the geographic size of the United States was increasing. We had the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which pretty much doubled the size of the United States. And then we had the growth of the Southwest through the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. And all of this is going to open up these large areas for cotton and tobacco and other agricultural products in production, which is going to further increase the demand for slave labor. And so this was the America that he was born into, a quickly growing young nation with immense opportunities before it, filled with tension as it still struggled to break away from this institution of slavery. So with this as the context, let's look at his life and some of his personal experiences as he speaks to them in his autobiography. Now, right at the beginning of his book, Douglass mentions that he was born the son of an African-American slave woman and a white slave owner. And the reason I find this interesting is because his dad, being white, was really of no benefit to him. And what I mean by that is it didn't really change his status as a slave. And in fact, in some ways, he explains that being the son of a white slave owner could often be worse due to how you were treated by your slave owner's wife, who, of course, wasn't too happy to have a constant reminder of her husband's infidelity every time she saw you. And not only that, but looking at photographs of him, it didn't seem to show in his physical appearance as might be true of others born in similar circumstances. And this might have been due to the fact that, as he explains, his mother was of darker complexion compared to that of a lot of the other blacks like his grandparents. And so you couldn't really just tell by looking at him that his dad was white and his mother was black. But I think the important question you have to ask is, why does this matter? And in some ways it does, and in some ways it doesn't. In my opinion, it matters for two main reasons. First, whether it should have or not, this reality affected Douglass's life and his experiences. Douglass was a slave even though his father was white and even though his father was free. And second, it gives us insight into the laws and the customs of the time period. You see, hundreds of years before Douglass was born, in colonial America in the early 1660s, it was established starting in Virginia that servants would inherit the status of their mother. And this was to break away from the traditional English law, which said that you inherited your father's status. In other words, a child born to an enslaved mother was a slave regardless of their father's status. And so this was true of Douglass. But let me talk about the realm in which his father being white and his mother being black doesn't matter. And that's in his value and his worth. And I don't mean in his monetary value as a slave, but his inherent value as a human being. The thing of greatest importance is that Frederick Douglass was human. In other words, his race and his skin color were clearly not the most important thing about him. Yet, because of the mindset of the people and the time period that he lived in, they tried to make it the most important thing about him. But the most important thing about Douglass was the fact that he was a human being created in the image of God and therefore had inherent dignity, value, and worth. In fact, Douglass and others going forward, such as Martin Luther King and people like Rosa Parks, all look forward to a day when people would stop judging people by the color of their skin, instead recognize the fact that every human being is created in the image of God, that their value as human beings comes from the fact that they are human. Now, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be judged by their actions or the content of their character, as King once stated, but even that doesn't change someone's value, this inherent dignity, value, and worth, that they're human regardless of their skin color or the situation in which they were born into. So you have this reality that Douglass lives in this society that is created by people with a mindset that his race and his birth status are the most important thing about him. And yet, luckily for Douglass and other abolitionists, they didn't believe that lie. And instead, they saw that the thing of greatest importance is that they, as blacks and whites, were all human beings. And I think this is such an important lesson for us in our modern context, that race is not the most important thing about anyone. It's not even top of the list when you think about what it means to be a human and how valuable that actually is. Now, another interesting aspect of Douglass's story that I want to look at is his early childhood. And as a young child, one of the things that he and many other slaves who were from the same area experienced was that they were separated from their mothers at an early age. And this was most often done before the baby even had their first birthday. And as was the case with Douglass, their mothers would be sent to work on a farm that was a good distance away. Then they would have an older slave woman who was too old to do your normal everyday hard work. That older woman would raise the children that had been separated from their parents. So you often have the situation in which children were separated from one of the most important relationships a child can have. So for Douglass, this meant he only got to see his mother a few times during his life. I think he mentions in his book, he saw her, or he got to connect with her like 4 or 5 times, and that was it. And he explains that when he did see her, in order to actually see her and for her to see him, she would have to go and travel by foot through the night, 12 miles one way in order to see him. And then she had to make sure to be back by dawn for her day's work the very next day. I mean, I can hardly imagine what the experience was like for his mother, let alone for Douglass himself. I mean, for a mother to be separated from her child and a child to be separated from their mother has to be one of the cruelest experiences any human can actually go through. Now, one of the things that I see as important in this scenario and in Douglass's story is the importance of the family unit, which is why slaves often would separate the mother from the sons and the rest of the family. It's because it was easier to control them once they were separated from those family bonds, which is something for us to think about in our modern culture, especially with the current breakdown of the family. It's easier to control people and it's easier to profit off of people when the family unit is broken down. But the family is one of the most important building blocks for a healthy society. And a healthy family is one of the most important foundation for us as individuals. In fact, there was a Pew Research article that I came across that was written back in 2015. And they did a study on the American family life and how the American family has been changing since the 1960s. And I want to read to you a quote from that research. It says, "Family life is changing. Two-parent households are on the decline in the United States as divorce, remarriage, and cohabitation are on the rise. And families are smaller now, both due to the growth of single-parent households and the drop in fertility. Not only are Americans having fewer children, but the circumstances surrounding parenthood have changed. While in the early 1960s, babies typically arrived within a marriage, today, fully 4 in 10 births occur to women who are single or living with a non-marital partner." And so it goes on to talk about how today only 46% of children are living in a family with two married parents in their first marriage. And I by no means would ever want to shame a single mom, and I know that life is complicated and the world is complicated. But the point is here, as a society, we're seeing these numbers go up. And we're seeing less children born in homes that have this strong family unit with both parents in the home. And we know that there are negative consequences to this. And here's why this is an issue. It's because children born in single-parent families are much more likely than children born into a nuclear family to fall into poverty and welfare and dependency, right? Not only that, but Patrick Fagan, I think is how you pronounce it, mentions in an article that he wrote in 1995, he says, "There is a wealth of evidence in the professional literature of criminology and sociology to suggest the breakdown of family is the real root cause of crime in America." And so this is, regardless of what you think about marriage and regardless of what your own experiences are and the complications in life, I think that we can all agree that the ideal is to have a household with both parents in a marriage who stay married and are together. That is the ideal. And as a society, we're now starting to deny that as the ideal, and we're starting to move away from that ideal. And so again, family is one of the most important building blocks of a healthy society, and a healthy family is one of the most important foundations for us as individuals. And so back during Douglass's time, slave owners would tear the family apart, and their slaves would have no choice in the matter. They had to follow, they had to listen, right? Or else face, torture or death or whatever it may be. But now in America, with the decline of the family, we're actually tearing apart the family ourselves. We're doing it by choice. And it's just interesting to think about the difference between that, right? We understand the importance of the family union, and we can see it as such a tragedy when we look back in history and we study stories like Douglass's story. And yet we're starting to, as a society, value that family unit less and less in our modern day. And I think we're already starting to see, and we're going to continue to see, the repercussions of decisions to break away from the importance of the family unit. Now, as we continue to look at his childhood, I want to read a passage out of his autobiography where he describes one of the conditions that he lived in. He says, "I suffered much from hunger, but much more from cold. In hottest summer and coldest winter, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on, but a coarse tow linen shirt, reaching only to my knees. I had no bed. I must have perished with cold, but that the coldest nights I used to steal a bag, which was used for carrying corn to the mill. I would crawl into the bag and there sleep on the cold, damp clay floor, with my head in and my feet out. My feet have been so cracked with the frost that the pen with which I am writing might be laid in the gashes." Now, not only did he have to battle hunger, but he had to battle the cold. As I was reading this quote and thinking about this, right now where I'm at in Utah, it's getting towards the end of winter, and it gets pretty cold here. Now, I'm in no way comparing my circumstances to his, right? I sleep in a house with a heater and I have blankets, as many blankets as I need. But I can sympathize because being constantly cold is one of the worst experiences. And if you hate being cold, you know what I mean by that. And the reason is we're not meant to be cold. I mean, scientifically, biologically, like we're warm-blooded creatures, right? I know that much. And so for that to be the reality of his childhood, experiencing cold, experiencing hunger on a regular basis, you look at his life and he's literally just in survival mode. He's just trying to survive. And you pause right here in his story and you think, what kind of a future does this little African-American slave boy have? Right? Torn away from his mother, no relation with his father, starved, freezing. Like, what type of hope? Where is this going? And yet, one of the things that we're going to see that makes this story so inspiring is that it doesn't end here. That all of the odds are stacked against him, and yet there is still hope. Now, when Douglass grows a little bit older, after he's been handed over to a new master, he tells the story of how he learned to read and write. And this is probably one of the most fascinating and inspiring parts of his story. At one point, in Douglass's story, he goes from being a slave on a plantation to becoming a house slave in Baltimore. And while in Baltimore, he receives his first instruction where he's taught the ABCs by his master's wife. This is his first introduction to being educated. The first time where someone has chosen to invest in him in this way. One of the few experiences at this point in his life where he's experiencing part of what it actually means to be human, to be intentionally taught and poured into by another. And so this is kind of a shining moment, but it's a short-lived moment. Because just as he's beginning to learn the basics of the ABCs and learning how to read and write, his master actually finds out that his wife has been teaching Douglass, and he scolds her for it and tells her that if she continues to teach him, he will no longer be fit to be a slave. In other words, the goal was to keep him ignorant so that it would be easier to control him. And so for Douglass actually overhears this conversation. And as he hears his master saying that being educated by learning to read and write, he would no longer be fit to be a slave, this actually sparks a desire in him to educate himself. And when we look at his life, educate himself he did. He now desired nothing less than to learn all he could. After his master's wife had stopped teaching him, he then goes to find a way, and he has to find a way to learn to read on his own. And so what he does is he goes and he finds some white boys in his neighborhood, and he explains to them that he wants to learn to read. And some of those boys, as he talks about in his book, are actually poorer off than he was as a slave. And so when it came to, things like food and things like that, and so what he would often do is he would sneak them food and he would trade it with them in order to gain their help in teaching him how to read and write. And once he learned enough to be able to read and write a little bit on his own, he would then have to sneak books around so that he could continue to educate himself. And all of this learning and all of this sneaking behind his back is at the risk of possibly being beaten for wanting to gain an education and for trying to educate himself. And he explains in his story that this actually happened multiple times, that he was beaten when he was found out that he was reading and trying to learn. But what I love about this part of his story is that it shows the value of having access to education. He saw how much of a gift it was to be educated and to find great books, and he read them over and over again. When he would find a great book, he wouldn't just read it once, but he would actually read it over and over again. And so he wanted to be educated, and he would fight to be educated, even though that education cost him something. And one of the things that we see running rampant in our society today is a sense of entitlement and kind of this victim mentality or a learned helplessness. And I know this isn't true about everyone. Obviously, this isn't true about everyone in our society, right? When we're casting kind of these broad strokes, trying to describe what our society's like, but we do see this today. And it seems to be becoming a major epidemic in our culture when it comes to this entitlement and kind of this sense of victim mentality. And you see it everywhere you go. I mean, it's fed by the media, our entertainment, politics. But then you read something like Frederick Douglass's autobiography, and you start to see that he had a different perspective. He saw just the opportunity of education as a gift, the opportunity to even be able to learn was a gift. And it was a gift that was worth sacrificing for. And once he was able to master that gift, he would even risk his own life. He would risk being beaten himself in order to share that gift with others. Such a different mentality than how many people view education in our modern world today. One of my friends and colleagues that I get to teach with, we were talking about this, and we were talking about just the value that education is and how much of a gift it is, and how hard it is to try to share that perspective with others and with students sometimes. And he spoke about the fact that he likes to make this joke with students when they're always complaining about how hard it is, how much work they have to put into education, that they're complaining about this sack of gold that they have to carry around with them. They're complaining about how heavy the sack of gold is that they're carrying. And I think that's a great example, and just kind of a funny way to look at it, but it's a great example that this really is a gift. It's like carrying around this bag of gold, and when we're complaining about it, we're complaining about something that we shouldn't be complaining about, right? Because it's such a gift to us. And that's why I appreciate reading great biographies and great autobiographies like Douglass's. It's because it brings things into perspective. It helps us to see things in a different way, especially when we are often so clouded by our culture that we don't have a clear lens to see through. And studying biographies and studying life stories can help give us such a greater perspective on life. And this idea that we're talking about right now, it actually brings us to the quote of the day. And so as always, as I read the quote of the day, I want you to try to guess who said it. They said, "The only people who achieve much are those who want knowledge so badly that they seek it while the conditions are still unfavorable." Take a moment, think about it. Guess who said it? If you guessed none other than mid-20th century author C.S. Lewis, you are correct. Now, what I love about this quote is how it truly is exemplified in Douglass's own life. That this was the reality for Douglass, and it was the reality for Lewis, two men who grew up and lived in completely different contexts. And yet, they both recognized this truth. And so I think about Douglass, a man who wanted knowledge so badly, he was willing to risk being beaten for the opportunity just to gain it. And I'm sure that you listening, you found this to be true as well in your own life. In order for you to reach your goals, you had to do it during times and circumstances that were not optimal, where you had too much on your plate, or finances were a struggle, or life felt overwhelming. Maybe it was for you as you were trying to get your degree. Maybe you were trying to get you're going to school for your undergraduate and the challenge there, or maybe you even pursued further education and life as you get older. You know, in high school, you think life's going to be so much easier and I'm going to have so much time on my hands after high school. And then you realize after you graduate, life only becomes more complicated. You know, often you get married and then you have your spouse to serve and to take care of, and then eventually you have kids and you have kids to take care of, and life just gets more and more complicated. And so even for me today, as I want to continue to pursue my education, as I want to continue to grow in knowledge and learning, this quote brings so much perspective along with reading biographies like Douglass. And so I guess my encouragement to you as you're listening is to think about that, to reflect on that, and to Maybe you've taken a break from pursuing your studies or your reading or from trying to grow in that way. My encouragement to you is to not stop, right? But to keep going and to continue to see this growing in knowledge and wisdom as a gift that we are given. Now, with that said, as we get ready to wrap up today, I hope you've enjoyed this first episode in this series, The Human Element, Biographical Perspectives. On the next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to continue with part 2 of Douglass's story as we see how things are going to get far worse for him before they actually get better. And we're also going to hear about his fascinating journey through faith and to his faith and his views on Christianity in the South. Now, just as a reminder, if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to leave a review and to share the Speaking Your Lingo podcast with your friends and with your family. With that, you can always connect with me on social media and speakingyourlingo.com. As always, I want to say thanks for listening, and I'll see you on